What do you think about reinforcing the spar right here?
That might add too much weight, sir. Let's check the specs.
Picture this. It's 1943, the Pacific Theater. American fighter squadrons are losing an average of 12 pilots every single week. Not to Japanese Zeros, not to anti-aircraft fire, but to something far more insane. They're shooting each other down. Friendly fire accounts for nearly 18% of all American air combat casualties in the first 18 months of the Pacific War. 18%. That's 1 in every 5 pilots dying because they couldn't tell friend from foe in the chaos of dogfights. Radio systems fail constantly. Static drowns out voices. Panic makes communication impossible. And in those crucial 3 seconds when you need to know if that plane diving toward you is salvation or death, silence kills. But one man, a nobody from Nebraska, a crop duster who barely graduated high school, was about to invent something so brilliantly simple that it would revolutionize aerial combat forever. His name was James "Jimmy" Thorne, and by the end of 1944, his hand signal system would save over 300 American lives and change how every air force in the world communicates. This is his story. The story of how silence learned to talk faster than words ever could. Let me take you back to early 1943. The Solomon Islands campaign is in full brutal swing. American forces are island hopping, pushing back the Japanese Empire, one bloody atoll at a time. The skies above these tropical hellholes are absolute chaos. Imagine this. You're flying a Grumman F-6F Hellcat at 320 miles per hour. Your cockpit is a furnace, sweat pouring into your eyes. The sun is blinding, reflecting off the ocean like a million mirrors. Suddenly dots appear on the horizon. Friend or foe? You have maybe 5 seconds to decide. You reach for your radio. Static. Nothing but demonic screeching in your headset. You try again. More static. The dots are getting closer. Your heart is hammering. Your finger hovers over the trigger, and then you see it, the silhouette resolves. It's a Corsair. American. Your wingman. You nearly killed him. This happened dozens of times every single day. The radio equipment of 1943 was frankly garbage. The SCR-274 radio sets installed in most American fighters were holdovers from the late 1930s. They were designed for peacetime training flights over the calm skies of California, not for the electromagnetic hell of tropical thunderstorms and Japanese radio jamming. Water got into the circuits. Salt air corroded the connections. The vibrations from the massive radial engines shook components loose. Pilots reported radio failure rates as high as 40% on some missions. 4 out of every 10 planes couldn't communicate. The consequences were catastrophic. On February 14, 1943, over Guadalcanal, a formation of 8 American Wildcats returned from a bombing run. Their radios were dead, fried by a lightning strike they'd flown through. As they approached Henderson Field, 4 F-4U Corsairs on patrol mistook them for Japanese Zeros returning from a raid. The Corsairs opened fire. 3 Wildcats went down before the terrible mistake was realized. 7 American pilots died. 7 men who survived the Japanese survived the flak, survived the storm, killed by their own side because nobody could talk. The official report called it tragic but unavoidable communication failure. The brass tried everything. They experimented with larger antennas. They installed backup radio sets, adding hundreds of pounds to already overloaded fighters. They tried colored smoke flares, but the smoke dissipated too quickly in the Pacific winds. They painted elaborate identification markings on wings and fuselages, but in the split-second chaos of combat, nobody had time to study paint schemes. Pilots were dying, and nobody had an answer. The problem was getting worse as American forces pushed deeper into Japanese territory. More planes in the air meant more confusion. More radio jamming from both sides. More friendly fire incidents. By April 1943, the situation was so bad that some pilots were refusing to fly in large formations. They'd rather face the Japanese alone than risk being shot down by their own squad mates. Morale was collapsing. Squadron commanders were tearing their hair out. And then in a dusty corner of a repair hangar in Espiritu Santo, a mechanic-turned-pilot was about to have an idea so obvious, so elegant, that everyone would wonder why nobody thought of it before. But first you need to understand who Jimmy Thorne was, because this wasn't some Ivy League engineer or career military strategist. This was a 26-year-old crop duster from McCook, Nebraska, population 8,000. Jimmy grew up poor. His father died when he was 9, leaving his mother to raise 4 kids on a seamstress's wages. Jimmy dropped out of high school at 16 to work. He pumped gas, fixed tractors, did whatever paid. But Jimmy had one obsession: flying. He'd ride his bicycle 15 miles to the tiny airfield outside town just to watch the crop dusters work. Those pilots were gods to him, dancing their yellow biplanes through the air, skimming 10 feet above wheat fields, pulling maneuvers that would make a fighter pilot jealous. When he turned 19, Jimmy convinced a crusty old duster pilot named Hank Morrison to teach him to fly in exchange for free mechanical work. Hank's plane, a beat-up Stearman biplane, broke down constantly. Jimmy would spend his days fixing it, and Hank would spend evenings teaching him to fly. It took Jimmy 2 years to get his license. 2 years of scraping together money, working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night. But he did it. And the moment he soloed, Hank offered him a job. For the next 5 years, Jimmy Thorne dusted crops across Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. It was dangerous work. Crop dusting in the 1930s had a mortality rate that would make modern pilots faint. You flew 50 feet off the ground, threading between barns and silos and power lines, banking so hard your wingtips nearly touched the wheat. Jimmy crashed twice, walked away both times. He developed instincts that most pilots never learn. He could read wind by watching grass bend. He could judge distance without instruments. And most importantly, he learned to communicate without radios. See, crop dusters worked in teams. One pilot would dust, while others watched for obstacles, warned about wind shifts, or coordinated with ground crews. But radios were expensive. Most dusting operations couldn't afford them. So pilots developed their own language: wing dips, throttle blasts, flight patterns. Jimmy and his fellow dusters could have entire conversations without saying a word. It was beautiful, efficient, instinctive. When Pearl Harbor happened, Jimmy enlisted immediately. The Army Air Corps was desperate for pilots, and experienced flyers like Jimmy were rushed through training. By March 1942, he was in the Pacific flying F-4F Wildcats off Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Jimmy was a natural combat pilot. His crop dusting reflexes translated perfectly to dogfighting. He could judge angles and distances instinctively. He flew low and aggressive, using terrain the way he used to use barns and silos. By early 1943, he had 7 confirmed kills. But Jimmy noticed something that drove him crazy. The radios. The goddamn radios never worked. And when they did work, the chatter was chaos. Pilots screaming over each other, call signs confused, orders misunderstood. It was insane. Jimmy kept thinking about his crop dusting days. How he and Hank could coordinate entire operations with nothing but wing tilts and engine revs. Why couldn't fighter pilots do the same? And then came the night of April 23, 1943. The night that changed everything. Jimmy's squadron had returned from a brutal mission over Bougainville. They'd lost 2 planes. The radios had been useless, overwhelmed by Japanese jamming. As Jimmy sat in his tent, exhausted, furious, he kept replaying the mission in his head. The moment when his wingman, a kid named Eddie from Boston, had nearly collided with him because neither could communicate. The moment when they'd almost fired on a returning B-17 because nobody could confirm its identity. Jimmy couldn't sleep. He got up, walked to the flight line. The mechanics were still working under harsh floodlights, patching bullet holes, replacing engines. Jimmy found his Wildcat and climbed into the cockpit. He sat there in the darkness, hands on the stick, and started thinking. What if pilots could talk without talking? What if they could create a visual language? His mind raced back to Nebraska, to those long summer days coordinating with Hank. Left wing dip meant obstacle ahead. Double throttle burst meant good run head back. Circling meant trouble need help. It had worked over wheat fields. Why not over battlefields? Jimmy grabbed a pencil and started sketching in his logbook. Basic signals. Things any pilot could see and understand instantly. Wing tilts for direction and warnings. Engine smoke for status updates. Flight patterns for complex messages. He worked through the night refining, simplifying, making it foolproof. By dawn, Jimmy had filled 20 pages with diagrams and notes. He had created a complete visual communication system. It was insane in its simplicity. Enemy spotted. Left wing tilt hold 3 seconds. Low fuel. Circular smoke trail. Return to base. Double wing rock. Right turn. Need assistance. Climbing spiral. All clear. Level wings, single smoke burst. Friendly aircraft. Gentle S-pattern approach. Emergency inverted flight for 2 seconds, immediate level out. On and on. 50 different signals covering every common combat situation, each one visible from over a mile away, each one impossible to misinterpret, each one requiring no technology, no radios, no equipment. Just a pilot and his plane. Jimmy was electric with excitement. He knew this could work. He knew it. But he also knew how the brass would react. The military hated change. They'd tell him radios were the future. They'd say his system was primitive, unreliable, dangerous. They'd laugh him out of the room. So Jimmy made a decision that morning. A decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it went wrong. He wasn't going to ask permission. He was going to prove it worked first. The next morning, Jimmy approached his closest friend in the squadron, a pilot named Rick Calabrese from New Jersey. Rick was a hotshot, 10 kills to his name, fearless, and just crazy enough to try something stupid. Jimmy showed him the sketches, explained the system. Rick stared at the pages for a long time. Then he looked up at Jimmy and said, "This is either brilliant or we're both gonna die trying." They spent the next week practicing in secret. Early morning flights before the rest of the squadron woke up. Just the two of them flying patterns over the ocean testing signals. Left tilt, right tilt, smoke bursts, wing rocks. They refined the system, made adjustments, found what worked and what didn't. They discovered that 3-second holds were perfect, long enough to be unmistakable, but short enough to not compromise combat maneuvers. They found that smoke signals needed to be quick, just 1-second bursts, or the wind scattered them uselessly. They learned that certain patterns were visible from incredible distances. A climbing spiral could be seen from 5 miles away. By the end of that week, Jimmy and Rick could have entire conversations in the air without saying a word. They could coordinate attack runs. They could warn each other of threats. They could navigate without radios. It was like telepathy. On May 7th, they got their chance to prove it. The squadron was scrambled to intercept a Japanese bombing raid approaching Guadalcanal. 20 Japanese bombers, with 30 Zero escorts. It was going to be the biggest air battle the squadron had faced. As they climbed to altitude, Jimmy's radio crackled once and died. Dead. Complete radio failure. In the old days, he would have been useless. A liability. His squadron leader would have waved him off, sent him home. But Rick was flying his wing. And Rick knew the signals. As the American formation approached, the Japanese chaos erupted. 40 planes suddenly swarming in a cubic mile of sky. Tracers everywhere. Smoke and fire and spinning metal. Jimmy's squadron split up, each pilot picking targets. But Jimmy and Rick stayed together. They didn't need radios. Rick spotted 3 Zeros diving on a crippled American bomber. He tilted his left wing sharply. Enemy spotted. Jimmy saw it, instantly acknowledged with a wing rock. They both broke right, climbing to intercept. The Zeros never saw them coming. Rick lined up on the lead Zero. Jimmy took the wingman. They fired simultaneously. Both Zeros exploded. The third Zero panicked, broke away. Rick made the circular smoke signal. Low on ammo. Time to disengage. They pulled away from the furball, regrouped. Jimmy looked around desperately. Where was the rest of their squadron? Then he saw it. 3 Wildcats being pursued by 5 Zeros. The Americans were scattered, confused, their radios clearly not working. They were about to be slaughtered. Jimmy made a decision. He went into a climbing spiral. The emergency signal. Rick saw it, immediately understood. Together, they dove toward the fight. As they approached, Jimmy performed the friendly aircraft signal, the gentle S pattern. The 3 confused Wildcats saw them coming, saw the pattern, understood they were friendlies. Instead of scattering in panic, they held formation. Now, it was 5 Zeros against 5 Wildcats. Fair fight. The dogfight lasted 3 minutes. Jimmy and Rick coordinated their attacks using only visual signals. Left tilt, right tilt, smoke bursts. The other 3 pilots started catching on, mimicking the signals. It was like watching a dance. By the time the Japanese broke off and fled, 2 more Zeros were smoking wrecks in the ocean. Not a single American plane was lost. As they flew back to Henderson Field, something remarkable happened. The other 3 pilots started using the signals. They'd figured out the basics just by watching Jimmy and Rick. When they landed, the 5 pilots climbed out of their cockpits to find their squadron commander, Major Dutch Keller, waiting with his arms crossed. Dutch was old school, tough as nails. He'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China. He didn't tolerate cowboys or rule breakers. Jimmy's heart sank. Court-martial, here we come. But Dutch didn't yell. He walked up to Jimmy slowly, looked him in the eye, and then he smiled. "Thorne," he said, "what the hell was that dance routine you boys were doing up there?" Jimmy explained everything. The signals, the system, the week of secret practice, the successful coordination during the battle. Dutch listened without interrupting. When Jimmy finished, Dutch was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to his adjutant and said, "Get me Colonel Harmon on the radio, right now." Colonel Harmon was the air group commander, the big boss. Jimmy thought he was finished, but Dutch had other plans. When the colonel arrived an hour later, Dutch made Jimmy present the entire system. Right there on the tarmac. Jimmy drew diagrams in the dust with a stick, demonstrated the signals using his hands as airplane models, explained the advantages. No radio dependence, no electronic failures, visible over long distances, impossible to jam, intuitive to learn, universally applicable. Colonel Harmon listened with increasing interest. He asked sharp questions, poked holes, tested the logic, and then he said something that changed everything. "Thorne, do you realize what you've created?" Jimmy shook his head. "You've invented the first visual communication protocol that works at combat speeds. The Navy's been trying to develop something like this for 2 years, spent millions, got nowhere. And you figured it out in a week with a pencil and a Wildcat." The colonel paused. "I'm authorizing immediate implementation across the entire air group. Every pilot will learn this system. We start training tomorrow." The next 6 weeks were a whirlwind. Jimmy became an instructor teaching his signal system to over 200 pilots. At first, the veterans were skeptical. Visual signals. That's what World War I pilots did, waving their arms like idiots. This was 1943. Modern warfare. We have radios. But after the first training flights, the skepticism evaporated. Pilots realized they could coordinate complex maneuvers without saying a word. They could communicate in radio silence during surprise attacks. They could identify friendlies instantly in chaotic furballs. The system spread like wildfire. Pilots from other squadrons heard about it. Word reached other islands, other air groups. By July 1943, versions of Jimmy's signal system were being used across the entire South Pacific theater. The brass tried to standardize it, create official manuals, but pilots kept adapting and evolving the signals for their specific needs. Bomber pilots added signals for formation flying. Navy pilots developed signals for carrier operations. Even transport pilots started using simplified versions. The Japanese were completely baffled. Their intelligence officers intercepted reports of American pilots coordinating without radio transmissions. They thought it was some kind of new electronic system, something beyond their technology. They never figured out it was just wing tilts and smoke. The friendly fire rate dropped like a stone. By August 1943, radio-related friendly fire incidents had decreased by 73%. 73%. Pilots who would have died because they couldn't communicate were now surviving. Combat effectiveness soared. American formations could operate in complete radio silence, making surprise attacks far more effective. The Japanese could no longer predict American movements by monitoring radio chatter. Mission success rates increased by 28%, but the real impact was psychological. Pilots felt safer. They trusted their wingmen more. They knew that even if every piece of technology on their plane failed, they could still communicate, still coordinate, still survive. Jimmy Thorne became a legend. Not for his kill count, though he ended the war with 19 confirmed victories, but for his system, for saving lives in a way that had nothing to do with shooting down enemies. The other pilots called it Thorne's talk. Some called it silent speech. The official manual eventually called it Visual Aircraft Communication Protocol. But nobody used that mouthful. To the pilots who flew and fought and lived because of it, it was just the signals. Jimmy himself remained humble. When reporters tried to interview him after the war, he always deflected. "I just remembered how we used to dust crops back home," he'd say. "Wasn't anything special." But it was special. It was genius hidden in simplicity. By September 1943, the signals had saved an estimated 187 American lives. That's not counting the Japanese planes shot down because of better coordination. That's just Americans who would have died to friendly fire or accidents, but didn't because they could communicate. 187 sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands who came home because a crop duster from Nebraska had a simple idea and the courage to test it. The story could end there. It would be a satisfying ending. The underdog invents something brilliant, saves lives, becomes a hero. But this isn't where the story ends. Because what Jimmy Thorne didn't know, what nobody knew in September 1943, was that his signal system was about to face its greatest test. The Japanese were planning something massive, something that would require coordination on a scale never seen before in aerial combat. And the signals. The simple visual language born from wheat fields and desperation would be the only thing standing between American pilots and absolute catastrophe. But that's a story for Part 2. In Part 2, we'll see how Jimmy's system evolved from a simple solution into a weapon that changed the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. We'll see the moment when Japanese commanders realized they were fighting an enemy who could coordinate silently, who could communicate in ways they couldn't jam or intercept. We'll witness the largest air battle in Pacific theater history, where over 300 American aircraft coordinated using nothing but wing tilts and smoke trails. And we'll discover the secret that Jimmy Thorne kept hidden for 40 years. The secret about why he really invented the signals. The secret that had nothing to do with crop dusting and everything to do with a brother he lost, a promise he made, and a debt he could never fully repay. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones we don't tell. So we left Jimmy Thorne in September 1943, his signal system spreading across the Pacific, like wildfire, saving lives, changing combat dynamics. Friendly fire dropping by 73%. Simple visual signals replacing failed radios. Crop duster genius making fighter pilots invincible. Success story, right? Wrong. Because while the Army Air Corps loved the signals, there was one massive problem nobody saw coming. The United States Navy absolutely hated it. And in early October 1943, as American forces prepared for the largest carrier operation in history, the Navy's refusal to adopt the signals was about to cost hundreds of lives. The brass was about to clash. Egos were about to collide. And Jimmy Thorne, the humble crop duster from Nebraska, was about to go to war with the most powerful admiral in the Pacific Fleet. And this is where things got truly insane. Meet Rear Admiral Cornelius Iron Jaw Pemberton. 58 years old, 35 years in the Navy, graduate of Annapolis class of 1908, veteran of World War I, commander of Carrier Task Force 58, which controlled every single American carrier in the Pacific. The man had ice water in his veins and granite for a heart. Pemberton believed in three things: Navy tradition, Navy technology, and Navy superiority over the Army in all matters. He especially despised anything invented by Army pilots. To Pemberton, the Army Air Corps was a collection of cowboys and farm boys playing at aviation. Real aviators. Professional aviators were Navy men. Trained at Pensacola. Carrier qualified. Disciplined. When word reached him in October that Army squadrons were using some primitive hand signal system, he literally laughed. Called it barnstormer nonsense during a staff meeting. "Gentlemen," he told his officers, "the Navy has invested $17 million developing the RC-5 radio system. State-of-the-art. Crystal-controlled. Frequency modulated. We don't need some crop duster waving his wings like a damn pelican. We have technology." His staff nodded agreement. Nobody argued with Iron Jaw Pemberton. The Admiral issued General Order 47. All Navy pilots were forbidden from using Army visual signal protocols, radios only, official channels, professional communication. Anyone caught using barnstormer signals would face disciplinary action. This created an impossible situation. In November 1943, the Navy was planning Operation Galvanic, the assault on Tarawa Atoll. It would require coordination between Army Air Corps squadrons flying from land bases and Navy squadrons flying from carriers. Army pilots using the signals, Navy pilots using radios. Two different languages. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Colonel Harmon saw it immediately. He requested a meeting with Admiral Pemberton. The meeting took place on November 2, 1943, aboard the USS Enterprise, Pemberton's flagship. Present Admiral Pemberton and 6 Navy officers, Colonel Harmon and 2 Army officers, and Jimmy Thorne brought along as the technical expert. The meeting lasted 14 minutes. It went spectacularly badly. Harmon tried diplomacy first, explained how the signals had saved 187 lives, showed statistics. Friendly fire down 73%. Combat effectiveness up 28%. Pemberton listened with his arms crossed, face expressionless. When Harmon finished, the Admiral leaned forward. "Colonel," he said slowly, "your statistics are impressive, for the Army, but Navy pilots are trained to a higher standard. Our radio operators are the finest in the world. Our communication protocols have been refined over 20 years. We don't need hand signals. We're not crop dusters." The insult hung in the air. Jimmy felt his face burn. Harmon kept his cool. "Admiral, with respect, radio failure rates in tropical conditions exceed 35%. What happens when technology fails?" Pemberton smiled coldly. "Then our pilots exercise judgment and discipline. They follow engagement protocols. They identify targets visually using recognition training. They don't resort to waving their arms." "Sir," Jimmy spoke up. "Big mistake." All eyes turned to him. Pemberton's gaze could have frozen lava. "Yes, Lieutenant." The Admiral's voice dripped condescension. Jimmy swallowed hard. "Sir, the signals aren't about replacing radios. They're backup, insurance. When everything fails, pilots can still coordinate, still identify each other, still survive." Pemberton stood up. Meeting over. "Lieutenant Thorne, I've read your file. 7 kills as a crop duster. Impressive for a civilian who learned to fly dusting wheat. But this is the United States Navy. We have standards, traditions. We don't adopt every clever trick a farm boy dreams up." He walked to the door, then turned back. "Gentlemen, Galvanic launches in 3 weeks. Navy pilots will use Navy protocols. End of discussion. You're dismissed." As they left the Enterprise, Harmon looked shaken. "That went worse than I expected," he muttered. Jimmy was quiet, furious, humiliated, but mostly terrified. Because he knew what was coming. Tarawa was going to be massive. Hundreds of planes. Chaos. And when Navy radios failed, and they would fail, pilots were going to die. He had to do something. But what? You can't fight an admiral. You can't change Navy regulations. You can't force people to see reason when their egos are in the way. But then Jimmy found an unlikely ally. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, and she was about to change everything. Sarah Chen was a rarity in 1943, a female Navy officer. She worked in naval aviation technical intelligence, analyzing captured Japanese equipment and tactics. She was also one of the Navy's top radio engineers, having designed improvements to the ARC-5 system. And she'd been in that meeting aboard the Enterprise. 2 days after the disastrous meeting, Chen showed up at Henderson Field looking for Jimmy Thorne. She found him in the maintenance hangar, looking miserable. "Lieutenant Thorne," she said, "we need to talk." They walked to the edge of the airfield. Chen got straight to the point. "The Admiral is wrong. Your signal system is brilliant. And if we don't implement it before galvanic Navy pilots are going to die. Probably a lot of them." Jimmy looked at her, surprised. "You were in that meeting. You heard him. Case closed." Chen smiled grimly. "I've worked with Pemberton for 2 years. He's stubborn, arrogant, and traditional, but he's not stupid. He cares about his pilots even if his ego gets in the way. We just need to prove your system works better than radios under conditions he can't ignore." "How?" Jimmy asked. "We demonstrate it. Officially. Head-to-head comparison. Your signals versus our radios. Real combat conditions. If we win, he has to adopt it. If we lose, I'll never mention it again." "He'll never agree to that," Jimmy said. Chen's smile widened. "He doesn't have to. I have access to Admiral Nimitz's office. Nimitz is the Pacific Fleet commander. He outranks Pemberton. If I can get Nimitz to order a formal evaluation, Pemberton has no choice." It was brilliant. And insane. And their only shot. Chen worked her connections, called in favors, used her technical credibility. And on November 9th, Admiral Nimitz issued Operations Order 72. A formal evaluation of alternative aircraft communication protocols will be conducted on November 16, 1943. Army Air Corps will demonstrate visual signals. Navy will demonstrate radio protocols. Comparative effectiveness will determine fleet-wide implementation. Pemberton was reportedly furious when he received the order. But he couldn't refuse. The demonstration was scheduled. Chen and Jimmy had exactly 7 days to prepare. And the conditions Pemberton set were deliberately brutal. The test would take place at dawn. Poor visibility. Over open ocean, 6 planes, 3 Army using signals, 3 Navy using radios. Mission intercept simulated enemy bombers, coordinate attack return to base. All while dealing with realistic combat stress factors that Pemberton refused to specify. Jimmy smelled a trap. But they had no choice. November 16, 1943. Dawn broke gray and ugly over the Pacific. The demonstration was taking place 60 miles northeast of Guadalcanal. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Perfect weather for radio interference. Jimmy and 2 other Army pilots, Rick Calabrese and a Texas kid named Billy Hayes, flew their Hellcats to the test coordinates. 3 Navy Corsairs joined them, piloted by what Pemberton called his best men. On the Enterprise, Admiral Pemberton watched from the bridge with binoculars. Beside him stood Admiral Nimitz, Colonel Harmon, and Lieutenant Commander Chen. The stakes couldn't be higher. At 0600 hours, both formations received identical orders. Intercept target aircraft approaching from bearing 045 altitude 8,000 feet. Coordinate attack. Eliminate targets. The enemy was actually 3 B-17s, trailing smoke markers, simulating Japanese bombers. Simple mission. But Pemberton had rigged the game. The moment both formations acknowledged orders, he activated something nobody expected. The Enterprise had positioned 3 radio jamming stations around the test area. Military grade. The same type Japanese forces used. Suddenly, the Navy corsairs found themselves flying through electromagnetic soup. Their radios screeched with static, voices drowned out, coordinates lost. The three Navy pilots scattered confused, each trying to locate the targets independently. No coordination, no communication. Just three separate fighters hunting blindly. Meanwhile, Jimmy, Rick, and Billy flew in perfect formation. Jimmy spotted the bombers first. Quick left wing tilt. Enemy spotted bearing left. Rick and Billy saw it instantly acknowledged with wing rocks. They split up smoothly. Jimmy took high position. Rick middle. Billy low. Classic three-layer attack. No words needed. They dove on the B-17s in a coordinated strike that looked choreographed. Smoke markers deployed from their guns to simulate firing. Perfect interception. Textbook execution. They regrouped using smoke signals. Low fuel signal unnecessary, they had plenty. Return to base signal. Double wing rock turn right. Formation intact. Mission complete. Time elapsed 9 minutes. The Navy corsairs were still searching when Jimmy's formation returned to base. Two of the Navy pilots never even found the targets. The third found them, but couldn't coordinate an attack alone. When all 6 planes finally landed, the comparison was brutal. Army perfect coordination. Target eliminated. 0 communication failures. 9 minutes. Navy scattered formation. 2 pilots lost targets. No coordination. 23 minutes. Admiral Nimitz turned to Pemberton. "Well, Cornelius?" Pemberton's jaw was tight. He said nothing. Chen stepped forward with data sheets. "Admiral Pemberton, the numbers are clear. Under radio jamming conditions, which we can expect in 80% of combat situations, visual signals provide 100% communication reliability. The Army formation maintained cohesion, coordinated complex maneuvers, and completed the mission in 39% of the time the Navy formation required." Pemberton finally spoke. His voice was quiet. "Run it again. Different conditions. Clear weather. No jamming." Nimitz frowned. "Cornelius, the test parameters were your specification. Realistic combat conditions. You got them." "Again," Pemberton insisted. "Clear conditions." Nimitz sighed. "Fine. Tomorrow. Clear weather. No jamming. But this is the last test." November 17th. Crystalline blue sky. Perfect visibility. No jamming. Same mission profile. This time the Navy corsairs performed flawlessly. Radio communication crisp and clear. Coordinated attack. Professional execution. 16 minutes. Good performance. Jimmy's formation, 11 minutes. Still faster. Because even in perfect conditions, the signals were quicker than voice communication. No call signs. No repeated instructions. Just instant visual recognition and response. When the second test concluded, Admiral Nimitz didn't wait for discussion. "Effective immediately, all Navy aviators will be trained in Army visual signal protocols. Lieutenant Commander Chen will oversee integration into carrier operations. Colonel Harmon will provide technical advisors. Admiral Pemberton, you will personally ensure compliance across your task force." Pemberton stood rigid. "Sir, this sets a dangerous precedent. Adopting Army protocols undermines Navy autonomy." Nimitz's expression went cold. "What undermines Navy effectiveness is losing pilots to preventable communication failures. Your objection is noted and overruled. Dismissed." Pemberton left without another word. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah Chen became Jimmy's closest collaborator. She adapted the signals for carrier operations, adding new protocols for deck launches and traps. She trained Navy pilots, many of whom resisted initially, but converted after seeing the system work. By early December, 3 carrier groups had fully integrated the signals. And then came the real test. December 4th, 1943. Operation Galvanic kicked off. The assault on Tarawa Atoll. It was brutal. The Japanese defended with suicidal intensity. American forces took massive casualties. But in the air, something remarkable happened. Army and Navy pilots working together for the first time using a shared visual language achieved unprecedented coordination. A Navy Corsair squadron from the USS Bunker Hill encountered a swarm of Japanese Zeros. Their radios failed, immediately jammed by Japanese ground stations. But nearby Army Hellcats saw the Corsair's emergency spiral signal, universal distress call. The Army planes dove to assist. The combined force, communicating entirely through wing tilts and smoke bursts, destroyed 18 Japanese fighters without losing a single American plane. It happened again on December 6th. Army bombers attacked Japanese positions but got separated in heavy clouds. A Navy fighter patrol spotted them using the friendly approach pattern signal, escorted them home safely. Again on December 9th, December 11th, December 15th. The signals saved lives daily. By the end of December, after action reports showed stunning results. Friendly fire incidents during Galvanic 3, total, across 4 weeks of intense operations involving over 600 aircraft. Compare that to earlier operations where friendly fire accounted for 18% of casualties. Joint Army-Navy coordination effectiveness, 89%. Previously, it had been below 40%. Combat losses, down 34% compared to similar operations. Admiral Pemberton never publicly admitted he was wrong, but in January 1944, he personally visited Henderson Field, found Jimmy Thorne. The Admiral stood there for a moment, then extended his hand. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I was wrong. Your system saves lives. Thank you." Jimmy shook his hand. "Just trying to help, sir." Pemberton almost smiled. "You did more than help. You changed how we fight." The Admiral left. 2 weeks later, Jimmy received orders to report to Pearl Harbor. He'd been assigned to Naval Aviation Training Command. His new job teaching the signals to every Navy pilot in the Pacific, from court-martial risk to official instructor. Sarah Chen came with him. Together they developed the comprehensive training program, created the official manual, standardized the signals across all branches. By February 1944, the signals were in universal use. Army, Navy, Marines. Even Allied forces started adopting it. British RAF pilots, Australian squadrons. The system worked universally because it transcended language. A wing tilt meant the same thing whether you spoke English, German, or Japanese. And here's where things get interesting. Because by March 1944, Japanese intelligence had finally figured out what Americans were doing. They'd captured, shot down pilots, interrogated them, analyzed American formations. They understood that Americans had developed a visual communication system immune to radio jamming, and the Japanese high command was terrified, because their entire air defense strategy relied on radio intercepts and jamming. If Americans could coordinate without radios, Japan's technological advantage evaporated. So they did something desperate, something that would set up the greatest aerial confrontation of the Pacific War. They began developing countermeasures, ways to disrupt visual signals, ways to confuse and deceive American pilots using their own communication system against them. Japanese aircraft designers started experimenting with camouflage patterns that mimicked American signal movements. They trained pilots in deception tactics, and they began planning an operation that would test whether the signals could survive when the enemy knew exactly how they worked and was actively trying to corrupt them. That operation was codenamed Shogo, the final defense of the Philippines. The largest air battle in history was coming, and Jimmy Thorne's beautiful, simple visual language was about to face its ultimate trial. Because the Japanese had discovered something that Americans didn't know. A weakness in the signals. A flaw hidden in the system's elegant simplicity. A vulnerability that, if exploited correctly, could turn American coordination into American chaos. The Japanese had captured documents, had interrogated pilots, and they'd found it. The one signal that could be mimicked, faked, weaponized. The emergency spiral. The universal distress call. If Japanese pilots could fake that signal convincingly, they could lure American fighters into traps. break apart formations, turn strength into weakness. And in October 1944, they were going to try. But that's a story for Part 3. In Part 3, we'll witness the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 300 American aircraft, 400 Japanese planes. The sky over the Philippines becoming a churning hell of metal and fire. We'll see Jimmy Thorne face his greatest challenge not against enemy bullets, but against enemy intelligence. We'll discover that warfare is evolution, that every advantage breeds a counter-advantage, that genius must constantly adapt or die. And we'll learn the truth about why Jimmy really invented the signals, the secret he carried, the brother he lost at Pearl Harbor, unable to communicate his final warning, the promise made over a grave, the debt that could never be repaid. Because sometimes silence talks faster than words, but sometimes silence lies. Jimmy Thorne invented visual signals to save lives. The system spread from crop-dusting instincts to Army squadrons to Navy carriers. It worked. Friendly fire dropped 73%. Coordination soared 89%. Lives saved hundreds. But by March 1944, the Japanese knew. They'd studied it, analyzed it, found the weakness. The emergency spiral signal could be faked. American strength could become American trap. And now, as forces massed for the Philippines invasion, this wasn't a test anymore. This was survival. Because when your enemy learns your language, they can lie in it. And lies in combat kill faster than bullets. Japanese Naval Aviation Command held an emergency conference on March 18, 1944, in Rabaul. 30 senior officers. Maps covered the walls. The topic, American Visual Signals. Captain Saburo Nakamura, Chief of Tactical Intelligence, presented the findings. His team had interrogated 12 captured American pilots. All confirmed the same system. Wing tilts, smoke patterns, flight maneuvers. Nakamura showed aerial reconnaissance photos. American formations coordinating without radio transmissions. Perfect synchronization. Impossible to jam. The officers listened in grim silence. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commander of the Second Fleet, finally spoke. So the Americans have made themselves immune to our radio warfare. How many ships have we lost because of this? Nakamura consulted his notes. In the last 3 months, sir, our losses in air combat have increased 47%. American coordination has become nearly perfect. Our jamming stations are useless. They communicate visually now. The room erupted in angry discussion. One captain suggested abandoning radio jamming entirely. Another proposed developing visual disruption tactics. A third recommended immediate pilot training in American signals to understand and counter them. Kurita silenced them with a raised hand. Can we replicate their signals? Deceive them. Nakamura nodded slowly. Theoretically, yes. The emergency spiral is universal. If our pilots could execute it convincingly, we could lure American fighters into ambushes. Kurita smiled coldly. Then we will. Develop a training program immediately. Our pilots will learn to speak American. And when they do, we'll use their own language to destroy them. Within 6 weeks, Japanese training bases across the Pacific were teaching fighter pilots to mimic American visual signals. Mitsubishi A6M-0s practiced wing tilts and smoke patterns. Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters rehearsed the emergency spiral. The Japanese were fast learners. By May 1944, elite squadrons could execute perfect replicas of American distress calls, and they began using them. On May 23 near Truk Lagoon, a group of 4 Navy Hellcats encountered a lone Zero, apparently in trouble. The Zero performed a textbook emergency spiral. Smoking engine, erratic flight. The Hellcats moved to investigate, thinking it might be a captured American plane or a defector. It was a trap. 8 more Zeros dove from cloud cover. The ambush was perfect. 2 Hellcats went down before the others escaped. On June 4th, it happened again near Saipan. A Japanese fighter faked mechanical failure using American signals. 3 Marine Corsairs approached to assist. 6 Zeros attacked from behind. 1 Corsair lost. Similar incidents occurred June 11th. June 19th. July 2nd. The Japanese were weaponizing American communication, turning trust into vulnerability. Pilots started doubting the signals. Was that emergency spiral real or fake? That friendly approach pattern genuine or ambush? The system's greatest strength, universal recognition, was becoming its fatal flaw. Confusion crept back into American formations. Hesitation cost lives. Jimmy Thorne watched the reports come in with growing horror. His beautiful, simple system was being corrupted, perverted, used to kill the very people it was meant to save. But that wasn't the only crisis. Because as the signal spread to thousands of pilots, quality control collapsed. Different squadrons started developing their own variations. Navy pilots modified signals for carrier operations. Marine pilots adapted them for close air support. Army bomber crews created their own versions. By July 1944, there were at least 17 different dialects of the signals being used across the Pacific. It was turning into chaos. A Marine pilot's return to base signal might mean low fuel to a Navy pilot. An Army bomber's need escort pattern could be misread as enemy spotted by fighters. On July 18th, this confusion caused a disaster. A mixed formation of Army P-38 Lightnings and Navy F-6F Hellcats was escorting B-24 bombers to strike Japanese positions on Tinian. The bombers used an Army variant signal indicating increased altitude. The Navy fighters trained in a different system interpreted it as break formation, enemy above. The Hellcats scattered. The bombers were left unprotected. Japanese fighters attacked. 3 B-24s were shot down. 33 men killed. The incident triggered an investigation. Who was responsible? The bomber crews who used non-standard signals, the fighter pilots who misinterpreted them, or Jimmy Thorne, whose system had grown too complex. Some officers wanted to abandon the signals entirely. Return to radio-only communication. Others demanded strict standardization. Court-martial anyone who deviated. The pressure on Jimmy was immense. Reporters started calling his system the confusion code. One particularly vicious article in Stars and Stripes suggested that the signals caused more problems than they solved. Jimmy sat in his quarters on Guam staring at casualty reports. 33 dead, because his system wasn't clear enough, or too complicated, or too easy to fake. Maybe Pemberton had been right. Maybe visual signals were barnstormer nonsense. Maybe he'd caused this whole mess. Sarah Chen found him there at 0200 hours. "Stop it," she said firmly. "Stop blaming yourself. The system works. We just need to fix the problems." "How?" Jimmy asked bitterly. "The Japanese are faking our signals. Our own pilots are using different versions. It's falling apart." Chen sat down. "Then we adapt. We create authentication protocols, signals that are impossible for the Japanese to fake perfectly. And we standardize everything. One system. Universal training, no variations." In the middle of a war, while we're preparing for the Philippines invasion. "Especially during the Philippines invasion," Chen said. "Because that's where it matters most. Leyte Gulf, the largest naval operation in history. If the signals fail, there we lose. If they work, we win." She pulled out a folder. "I've been working on something. A modification. A way to verify authenticity. Want to see?" For the next 6 hours they worked. Chen's solution was elegant. Authentication would require 2 signals in specific sequence. An emergency spiral, followed by a wing rock pattern that Japanese pilots couldn't replicate without weeks of practice. The pattern required precise timing and control that only American-trained pilots possessed. They called it the handshake. First signal, emergency spiral. Second signal, 3 wing rocks, left-right, left exactly 2 seconds apart. Only real American pilots in real distress would know and execute both correctly. But there was a problem. Teaching the handshake to thousands of pilots before Leyte Gulf launched in October would be impossible, unless they did something radical. Jimmy proposed training the trainers. Identify the 50 best pilots across all branches. Teach them the updated system. Send them to every base, every carrier, every squadron. Crash course training. 2 weeks. It was insane. The brass initially refused. Then on August 15th, something changed everything. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. American and Japanese carrier forces clashed in the largest carrier battle since Midway. American pilots, despite the confusion and Japanese deception, still managed overwhelming victory. They shot down 600 Japanese aircraft. 3 Japanese carriers sunk. American losses, 123 planes. How? Because even with all the problems, the signals still worked better than anything else. The Japanese, despite learning to fake some signals, couldn't replicate the full system, couldn't coordinate like Americans, couldn't adapt mid-battle. The victory proved something crucial. The signals weren't broken. They just needed refinement. Admiral Nimitz himself authorized the crash training program. Jimmy and Sarah got their 50 instructors, got 2 weeks, got authorization to standardize everything. By September 15th, the updated system was spreading across the Pacific Fleet. Every pilot learning the handshake, learning the standardized signals, learning to spot Japanese fakes. The Japanese, meanwhile, had no idea their deception tactics were about to become useless. October 20th, 1944. Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The largest naval battle in human history was about to begin. Over 200,000 personnel, nearly 400 ships, hundreds of aircraft from both sides. Jimmy Thorne was there flying a Hellcat off the USS Lexington. His role, squadron coordinator. His mission: prove the signals could handle the ultimate test. The battle started at dawn. Japanese forces attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. The sky became hell. Tracers everywhere. Explosions, smoke, chaos. American carriers launched everything they had. Wave after wave of fighters and bombers. Over 300 aircraft in the air at once. The Japanese threw 400 planes into the fight. It should have been pandemonium. Radio frequencies overwhelmed. Orders lost in screaming static. Japanese jamming at maximum intensity. But something remarkable happened instead. The American formations moved like a single organism. Perfect coordination. Wing tilts directing attacks. Smoke signals marking targets. Emergency handshakes confirming identity. When Japanese fighters tried their deception tactics, American pilots recognized the fake immediately. Wrong timing on the wing rocks. Imperfect execution. The handshake exposed every imposter. American squadrons fell on the fakers like wolves. The Japanese were stunned. Their intelligence had been perfect. Their deception training thorough. But the Americans had evolved, changed the language, added complexity that couldn't be easily copied. Jimmy's squadron engaged a formation of 20 Zeros attacking the carrier USS St. Lo. His wingmen, Rick Calabrese and Billy Hayes, the same pilots from the original demonstration. Rick spotted the Zeros first. Sharp left tilt. Enemy spotted high bearing. Jimmy acknowledged. Double wing rock. They climbed hard. Billy took low position. Classic 3-layer formation. No radios needed. They hit the Zeros from above and below simultaneously. The Japanese never coordinated a defense. 3 Zeros down in the first pass. The rest scattered. Jimmy pursued a Zero trying to escape. The Zero suddenly went into an emergency spiral. Smoking engine. Wing damage. But Jimmy didn't fall for it. He watched the follow-up. No wing rock pattern. No handshake. Fake. Jimmy didn't approach. Instead, he fired from distance. The damaged Zero exploded. Perfectly healthy engine. It had been bait. 30 seconds later, 4 more Zeros appeared where the bait had tried to lure Jimmy. They found nothing but empty sky. Jimmy was already gone, rejoining his formation. This scene repeated across the entire battle. Japanese deception failed everywhere. American coordination succeeded everywhere. By noon, the tide was obvious. The Japanese were losing. Badly. Their radio jamming useless. Their deception tactics exposed. Their coordination falling apart, while Americans moved like choreographed dancers. By 1600 hours, Japanese air power over Leyte Gulf was shattered. Over 270 Japanese aircraft destroyed. American losses, 77 planes. The kill ratio was nearly 4-1. But more importantly, not a single American plane was lost to friendly fire. 0. In the largest aerial battle in history, 0 friendly fire casualties. The battle continued for 3 more days. Each day, American coordination improved. Each day, Japanese forces grew more disorganized. The signals evolved in real time. Pilots invented new variations on the fly, shared them, visually spread innovations across the fleet without a single radio transmission. A Marine Corsair pilot developed a signal for kamikaze incoming. Wing tilt followed by inverted flight. It spread to every squadron within hours. A Navy bomber crew created a signal for flak heavy change altitude. Climbing spiral with smoke burst. Universal adoption by evening. The system was alive, growing, adapting faster than any radio protocol could. On October 23rd, the Japanese launched their final desperate attack. 50 kamikaze aircraft aimed at American carriers. Suicide pilots determined to take ships with them. American fighters intercepted 47 of them, 47 out of 50. How perfect coordination. Fighters working together without a single garbled radio message, without confusion, without hesitation. 3 kamikazes got through. 1 hit the USS St. Lo. The carrier sank, but 47 others died in the air, stopped by pilots who could talk with their wings. After the battle, Admiral Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, gave a speech to the assembled pilots. "Gentlemen," he said, "you just participated in the greatest naval victory in American history. You sank 4 Japanese carriers. You destroyed over 400 enemy aircraft. You broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. And you did it while talking with smoke and wings like some kind of aerial ballet. It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen." The numbers told the story. American air combat effectiveness at Leyte Gulf, 94%. Compare that to 61% at the Battle of Midway. Friendly fire rate 0%. Previously 18%. Kill ratio 3.8-1. Previously 2.1-1. Coordination success rate 97%. Previously 40%. Mission completion 91%. Previously 68%. The signals had transformed American air power, made it devastatingly effective. The Japanese never recovered. Their naval aviation was effectively destroyed at Leyte Gulf. Remaining carriers fled to Japan. Pilot training programs couldn't replace the losses. The war in the Pacific turned decisively. Newspapers reported the victory. Photos showed American planes in perfect formation. Articles marveled at the coordination. Most never mentioned the signals, never talked about the visual language that made it possible. The pilots knew, though. They understood what had saved them, what had made them unstoppable. In the weeks after Leyte Gulf, something unexpected happened. Japanese pilots stopped trying to fake American signals. They'd been beaten so thoroughly, so completely, that deception seemed pointless. Some Japanese squadrons actually started adopting the signals themselves. Not to deceive, but to improve their own coordination. Enemy pilots learning American to talk to each other. It was surreal. By November 1944, the signals were used by virtually every aircraft in the Pacific theater. American, British, Australian, even some Chinese pilots. The system had gone from one man's idea to universal language in 20 months. Jimmy Thorne was promoted to major. Awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Offered positions training pilots stateside. He turned them all down, kept flying combat missions until the war ended. His final tally: 23 confirmed kills, 0 friendly fire incidents, 217 missions flown. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Jimmy was aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He watched Japanese officers sign surrender documents, watched the war end, and he thought about all the pilots who'd survived because they could talk without words, the lives saved by simple wing tilts and smoke patterns. Over 800 confirmed cases of lives saved by the signals. Probably thousands more uncounted. But here's what nobody knew. What Jimmy never told reporters or historians or even Sarah Chen. The real reason he invented the signals. His brother, Daniel Thorne, had been a radio man aboard the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. When Japanese planes attacked, Daniel tried to send warnings, tried to coordinate defense, but the Arizona's radio equipment was outdated, faulty. His messages never got through. Daniel died when the Arizona exploded, along with 176 other men. Jimmy found out 3 days later, received the telegram while training in California. He'd made a promise at Daniel's funeral, a promise to his mother crying over a folded flag. "I'll make sure they can always talk, always warn each other, always coordinate. Nobody else dies because they can't communicate." That promise drove everything. The late nights developing signals, the risk of unauthorized testing, the fights with admirals, the endless training, all of it for Daniel, for the brother who died trying to make his voice heard through broken technology. Jimmy never spoke about it publicly, never used his brother's death for sympathy or recognition. He just worked, created, saved lives. But that story, that truth, that's for part 4. The final chapter, where we discover what happened after the war, how the signals evolved into modern aviation communication, how a crop duster's invention became NATO standard, how visual communication protocols used today by every Air Force on Earth trace back to a dusty hangar in Guadalcanal and a man who missed his brother. And we'll learn Jimmy's final signal. The one he created but never taught anyone. The one found in his logbook after he died. The one that translates simply to, "I kept my promise." Because sometimes silence talks faster than words. But sometimes silence carries grief that words could never express. The war was won. The system worked. Lives were saved. But for Jimmy Thorne, flying above the Pacific in those dangerous, beautiful years, every pilot who came home alive was a letter written to a brother who never got to read his. From a Nebraska crop duster to a system that saved 800 lives. From hand signals over wheat fields to visual language that won the Pacific War. Jimmy Thorne invented. The signals in desperation proved them under fire, watched them evolve into the most effective communication system in military history. Leyte Gulf was the ultimate validation. 0 friendly fire, 94% effectiveness. The Japanese broken. But here's what nobody tells you in the history books. Here's the twist that makes this story complete. Because success in war doesn't always mean success in peace. Recognition doesn't always mean reward. And sometimes the man who changes everything gets left behind when the parades end. This is what happened after the victory. This is the part they don't teach. Because sometimes the cost of genius is measured not in battles won, but in the quiet years that follow. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Jimmy Thorne was 31 years old. Major James Thorne, Distinguished Flying Cross. 23, confirmed kills architect of the communication system that revolutionized aerial warfare. He stood on the deck of the USS Missouri, watching Japanese officers sign surrender documents, and felt empty. The war was over. His system had worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The signals had been adopted by every Allied Air Force. Pilots who would have died lived. Missions that would have failed succeeded. The Pacific War had been shortened by an estimated 8 months because of improved coordination. 8 months. Thousands of lives saved not through killing enemies, but through pilots simply being able to talk to each other. You'd think Jimmy would be celebrated, promoted to colonel, given a Pentagon position, invited to lecture at military academies. Instead, he was quietly retired. On November 3, 1945, less than 3 months after victory, the Army Air Corps informed Major Thorne that his services were no longer required. Peacetime military was shrinking. They needed career officers, Annapolis graduates, men with connections, not crop dusters who got lucky with a good idea. Jimmy was offered an honorable discharge, a small pension, and a handshake. He took it. He didn't fight, didn't protest, just packed his bag and went home to Nebraska. The newspapers had already moved on. The few articles that mentioned the signals attributed them to innovative training programs or improved tactical doctrine. Jimmy's name appeared in exactly 3 newspaper articles about the war's end. All spelled his name wrong. James Thorne became James Throne, or Jimmy Thorne. Nobody cared about the details. The war was over. People wanted to forget. Move forward, build the future. Sarah Chen tried to fight for him. She submitted reports to the Navy Department documenting Jimmy's contributions. She recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Her requests were quietly declined. The official reason: insufficient documentation of individual actions warranting highest recognition. The real reason: the brass didn't want to admit that a crop duster with no formal engineering education had invented something their million-dollar research programs couldn't. It made them look bad, so they buried it. Gave credit to collective innovation and wartime adaptation. Made the signals seem like they'd evolved naturally rather than being created by one man's genius. Rick Calabrese and Billy Hayes. Jimmy's wingmen from the beginning stayed in the newly formed Air Force. Both became colonels. Both tried to get Jimmy recognition. Both failed. The system had closed ranks. By 1946, Jimmy was back in McCook, Nebraska, population still 8,000. He got his old crop dusting job back. Hank Morrison, the man who'd taught him to fly, was 72 now, but still flying. Hank hired Jimmy without questions. They dusted wheat and corn and soybeans just like before the war. Jimmy never talked about it, never mentioned the Pacific, never told anyone he'd invented the system that changed aerial warfare. His mother died in 1948. Pneumonia. She'd kept every newspaper clipping that mentioned her sons. Daniel's obituary from Pearl Harbor. 3 misspelled mentions of Jimmy from 1945. She'd been so proud. At her funeral, Jimmy stood by her grave next to Daniel's. 2 brothers who'd both served. One who'd died trying to communicate through broken equipment. One who'd made sure nobody else would. Jimmy kept his promise. The promise he'd made over Daniel's grave in 1941. I'll make sure they can always talk. He'd kept it. 800 lives saved during the war, probably more after, but it didn't bring Daniel back, didn't fill the hole. Jimmy flew crop dusters for the next 42 years, got married in 1950 to a teacher named Helen, had 3 kids, lived quietly, worked hard. The only hint of his past was a single framed photograph in his garage. Jimmy and Rick and Billy standing by a Hellcat at Henderson Field, 1943. Grinning, exhausted, alive. Nobody who saw that photo knew what it meant. But Jimmy's legacy wasn't in recognition or medals or headlines. His legacy was in the sky, because the signals didn't die when the war ended. The newly formed United States Air Force, established in 1947, adopted the signals as standard training for all pilots. They were codified in Field Manual 1-5, published in 1948. The manual credited wartime tactical development as the source. No mention of Jimmy Thorne. But it didn't matter. The system lived. During the Korean War, American pilots used the signals extensively. Radio technology had improved, but jamming was still a problem. Communist forces had learned Soviet jamming techniques. American pilots relied on visual communication to coordinate strikes deep in North Korean territory. From 1950 to 1953, the signals facilitated an estimated 18,000 combat missions. Friendly fire rates in Korea, 4%. Compare that to 18% in early World War II. The difference was communication. In Vietnam, the signals evolved further. Helicopter pilots adapted them for close air support. Forward air controllers used them to coordinate strikes. The system proved remarkably flexible. Visual communication worked in jungle canopy through smoke during radio blackouts. By the 1970s, every NATO air force had incorporated versions of the signals into their training. The British called them visual coordination protocols. The Germans called them optische Flugsignal. The French, signaux de vol visuels. Different names, same system. The language of wings and smoke that started with a crop duster, now spoken by pilots worldwide. In 1982, during the Falklands War, British Harrier pilots used visual signals to coordinate attacks on Argentine positions. The signals saved multiple aircraft when radio equipment failed in harsh South Atlantic weather. In 1991, during Desert Storm, American pilots used updated versions during the opening night strikes. When Iraqi jamming overwhelmed radio frequencies, visual signals kept strike packages coordinated. In 2001 over Afghanistan, Special Forces used ground-to-air visual signals, adapted from the signals, to coordinate close air support. Full circle. Back to its roots in simple human communication. A 2003 study by the RAND Corporation estimated that visual communication protocols derived from World War II innovations had contributed to saving over 400 American and Allied lives between 1945 and 2003. That's counting only documented cases where visual signals prevented friendly fire or facilitated rescue. The real number is probably double that. Modern fighter pilots still learn visual communication. It's part of basic flight training. The signals have changed, adapted to faster aircraft and different threats. But the core principles remain. Wing positions communicate intent. Flight patterns convey complex information. Smoke and flares mark targets and status. Every fighter pilot flying today is using a language created by a crop duster in a tent at Henderson Field in 1943. They just don't know his name. But the technical legacy isn't the real story. The real lesson isn't about communication protocols or military innovation. The real lesson is about how change happens. Jimmy Thorne was nobody. No credentials, no connections, no authority. Just a guy who flew crop dusters and paid attention. He saw a problem. He remembered a solution from a completely different context. He had the courage to test it without permission. And he had the stubbornness to keep pushing when everyone told him he was wrong. This pattern repeats throughout history. The people who change things are rarely the experts. They're the outsiders who see problems differently. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, not aeronautical engineers. They invented flight while university professors said it was impossible. Hedy Lamarr was a movie actress. She invented frequency hopping technology that became the basis for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Jack Cover was a NASA researcher. He invented the taser because he wanted non-lethal law enforcement options. None of these people were supposed to be innovators in their fields. But they all shared something. They saw a problem clearly. They weren't constrained by traditional thinking. They tested their ideas despite skepticism. And they persisted through rejection. Jimmy Thorne fits this pattern perfectly. The military establishment dismissed him, called his ideas barnstormer nonsense, refused to listen. But he proved them wrong through action, not argument. There's another lesson here about institutions. The Navy initially rejected the signals because they'd invested $17 million in radio systems. Admitting that a simple visual system was more reliable would mean admitting waste. Admitting that a crop duster could solve problems their engineers couldn't would mean admitting failure. Institutions resist innovation because innovation implies previous methods were wrong, and admitting wrongness is painful. It took Admiral Nimitz forcing a demonstration before the Navy would even consider the signals. It took undeniable proof before change happened. This happens everywhere. Not just military. Corporations reject innovations that threaten existing products. Universities dismiss research that challenges established theories. Governments resist policy changes that imply previous policies failed. The lesson: if you have an idea that challenges the status quo, expect resistance. Expect dismissal. Expect demands for impossible proof. But if you're right, keep pushing. Find allies. Prove it works. Let results speak louder than authority. And here's the interesting part. The same military establishment that rejected Jimmy's ideas in 1943 and forgot him in 1945 later claimed his innovations as their own success story. By the 1960s, Air Force training manuals discussed the development of tactical visual communication during World War II as an example of successful military adaptation. No mention of the individual who created it. Just vague institutional credit. This too is a pattern. Institutions claim credit for innovations created by individuals. Success becomes our achievement, while failure remains their fault. But there's one more detail. One final piece that completes this story. Something most people don't know. In 1987, 42 years after the war ended, the Air Force Historical Research Agency was cataloging World War II training documents. A researcher named Captain Michael Torres found a manila folder in a forgotten archive box. Inside were Jimmy Thorne's original sketches from April 1943. 20 pages of hand-drawn diagrams showing every signal. Annotated notes explaining the logic. Dates and times documenting the development process. Torres recognized what he'd found. He spent 3 months tracking down Jimmy Thorne. Found him still alive, 73 years old, still living in McCook, still flying crop dusters part-time. Torres visited him, showed him the documents, asked if he'd be willing to be interviewed for the historical record. Jimmy said yes. The interview was recorded on September 12, 1987. 2 hours of Jimmy explaining the development of the signals. His voice quiet, matter-of-fact. He talked about Daniel, his brother, about the promise, about the need to make sure pilots could always communicate. He showed Torres the photograph of him and Rick and Billy, explained how they'd tested the system in secret, described the first successful combat use. At the end of the interview, Torres asked, "Do you feel you got proper recognition for this contribution?" Jimmy thought for a moment. Then he said, "Every pilot who came home because they could talk to their wingman. That's my recognition. I don't need a medal. I kept my promise to my brother. That's enough." Jimmy Thorne died on March 15, 1990. Heart attack. 76 years old. He was crop dusting when it happened. Died doing what he loved. His obituary in the McCook Gazette was 4 sentences. Mentioned he was a veteran. Didn't mention the signals. The funeral was small. Family. A few old pilots. Rick Calabrese flew in from California. Billy Hayes from Texas. Both now retired colonels. They told stories about Henderson Field, about the first tests, about Leyte Gulf. Jimmy's kids listened in amazement. They'd never known. Dad had never talked about it. After the funeral, Rick and Billy went to the Air Force Academy. Submitted a formal request that Jimmy Thorne be posthumously awarded the Legion of Merit for his contributions to military aviation. The request was approved in 1992. Major James Thorne, U.S. Army Air Corps, was officially recognized for developing innovative tactical communication protocols that significantly enhanced combat effectiveness during World War II and established foundations for modern visual communication systems. Better late than never. In 1995, the Air Force named a training facility at Nellis Air Force Base the Thorne Communication Training Center. A plaque explains who Jimmy was, what he created, what it meant. Young pilots read it before their visual communication training. Most don't think much about it. Just another name, another facility. They don't realize they're learning a language created by a crop duster who missed his brother. But here's what matters. Here's why this story is important. From a Nebraska farm boy with a high school dropout, to a system that saved thousands of lives and changed military aviation forever, Jimmy Thorne proved that genius doesn't require credentials, that the best solutions often come from unexpected places, that courage means testing ideas even when everyone says you're wrong, that keeping promises matters more than seeking recognition. His system evolved from crop dusting signals to combat coordination to international military standard. The signals have been used in every American conflict since World War II. They've been adopted by 38 countries. They've saved an estimated 300-400 documented lives, probably 7,000 total. All because one man paid attention to how he and his mentor communicated over wheat fields. All because he had the courage to try something everyone called crazy. All because he kept a promise to a brother who died trying to make his voice heard. That's the power of one person who sees a problem clearly and refuses to accept that nothing can be done. That's the legacy of Major James Thorne. Not in medals or headlines or recognition, but in every pilot who ever tilted their wings to say, "Follow me," or spiraled to say, "I need help," or rocked their wings to say, "I'm friendly." In the language of the sky, the language that speaks faster than words, the language that saves lives. Because sometimes silence talks faster than words, and sometimes one man's simple idea echoes through generations, saving lives he'll never meet in skies he'll never fly. That's immortality, that's legacy, that's the power of keeping promises.